My pleasure to introduce Dr. Helen Hambly, who is an Associate Professor of Capacity Development and Extension here at the University of Guelph, where she's been since 2003, but she has a fairly long history in the area that she's about to talk to you about. Prior to joining the University of Guelph, she's worked for several years at the consultative group of the International Agriculture Research as a Gender and Capacity Development Specialist. And she's the former chair and current secretary of the Independent Advisory Committee for the RTB Roots, Tubers, and Bananas program. And so I presume this is part of the agroforestry work and some of the stuff you've done in the past.
Yeah, related. Mm-hmm.
With an annual budget of about $85 million in 2016 figures. So it's currently one of the largest consortia of the global system of publicly funded agriculture research and development. Dr. Hambly attended the University of Toronto and obtained her PhD from York University. She led and participated in various gender and innovation initiatives with the IDRC, World Bank, the FAO, and other international agencies, and has done so since the mid-1980s. And after coming to UOG in 2003, she's broadened her research and teaching to agricultural innovation systems, communication for development, including a focus on rural internet in Ontario, so the whole issue of rural connectivity. She's not going to talk much about that today, but maybe in another talk down the road.
Yeah, different.
But the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Thanks all of you for showing up this afternoon, and I'm pleased to be here in the School of Environmental Sciences. I feel really comfortable here in SES actually, but I come from another school, the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. And I am a classic interdisciplinary researcher. I'm a couple classes short of a forestry degree, and I couldn't do the chainsaws and the chemicals as an undergraduate. There was something there that just didn't fit, and instead what I did is I focused as a student on social issues in agroforestry and in sustainable agriculture. So this is way back in the 80s when agroforestry was just really gaining ground, and I'm really pleased that it's my colleague Naresh Devathasan who suggested that SES invite me over here today to talk a little bit about the work that I've done as a social researcher in agricultural, environment, and food security sciences. So I hope for those of you who are natural scientists, you'll bear with the social scientist in me, and for those of you who also identify as being interdisciplinarian, I think this will be interesting then for you to look at this topic. So the title of today's presentation is CFIUS's Tasks, Gender Transformative Approaches in Agriculture, Environment, and Food Security. So I'm going to warm you up with a video, and of course my video comes from YouTube. And there's a number of wonderful CFIUSan YouTube videos, and I've picked one from Denmark, produced in Denmark, and so let's have a listen to this one. If you don't know the legend, this will introduce it to you. So That's the legend. And this is the presentation. The legend of Cepheus is a really beautiful legend, highly contested in the literature. Still to this day, one of the SES former faculty brought me a Jungian approach to midlife crisis, Cepheus, and I think this fits very well with this presentation. Peter van Straten, thank you very much, and it's my weekend reading. Cepheus is a legend that teaches us a number of different things. And it's fascinating in terms of the visualization that you just saw here, and also the Titian, the beautiful Titian portrait of Cepheus carrying the rock. Not just because rocks are something that a school like SES care about, but the rock itself is a symbol of burden, and of a burden that was placed upon an individual, in this case Cepheus, a former king of Corinthia, as we now know it, to push up a hill for all eternity. Now you must ask, why did this noble person, Cepheus, have this burden? Why is he pushing this boulder up a mountain for all eternity? Well, it's because he tricked the gods. He tricked the Greek gods, and in the legend, he was punished by the gods for what they saw as cunning, irreverent, unfaithful, disloyal behavior towards them by someone who is a leader of the people. So Cepheus was condemned for all eternity to roll this boulder, but the boulder itself is a symbol. It's a carrier of other meaning. And in my field of agricultural communication and development studies, we deal with symbols all the time. And the boulder itself is a symbol of something that Cepheus actually develops a relationship. And it's what we call a love-hate relationship, where the boulder becomes part of him. It's an extension of Cepheus in the end. Because after you roll a boulder uphill over so many years, and some of you might relate to this very well, you develop this horrible love-hate relationship with this thing. And this thing, in my story today, is my research on gender. As an interdisciplinary scientist in the field of agriculture, environment, and food security. It's a love-hate relationship. It's a relationship of toiling over now 30 years in my own career with this concept. And I feel very much like Cepheus, as if we've rolled this immense boulder up a hill to the peak of the mountain, and it's sitting there at the peak of the mountain, just poised to either roll back over me and flatten me once more in my life, or roll down the cliff, roll away, and break up as a boulder into smaller pieces of rocks and pebbles, so that it is no longer a burden or a weight on anyone's shoulders. And to me, that's the value of this legend. The value of the legend tells us that the things that we have this love-hate relationship with as researchers may one day reach the peak and roll away. And that's the story I'm going to tell you today. So I'm going to tell you how that happened. So first of all, we have to recognize that research in the area of gender and the natural sciences has actually been with us for close to 30, 40 decades as active research. This research is embedded in a much longer discourse that goes back into the turn of the century, especially with the age of industrialization, where social inequality, especially for women and children in the age of industrialization, began to emerge on the consciousness of policymakers. It began to emerge on the streets through demonstration and social mobilization for the right to vote, for the rights of children in industry, in Western societies. And in many parts of this wonderful world that we live in, the whole topic of gender and the consciousness around gender is mute. Because in many societies of the world, there was no inequality based on biological sex. It was imposed upon them, just as the age of colonialism imposed other elements of social inequality on countries that we now know as the global south. So we have to ask ourselves as researchers, why is it still on the agenda? We've been working on these issues for 30 to 40 years. Why is it still with us? And then also because our research is done within national institutions or provincial institutions like University of Guelph, but also globally. What is our role in talking about gender in the natural sciences, and how do our institutions engender or set out to improve gender issues in science, technology, and development? So I'm going to be talking about these today, and I'm going to be using this definition on gender. So for those of you who are not familiar with the social sciences, we define gender as the socially constructed gender roles and relations, both between men and women, and with their intersecting identities of race, ethnicity, age, class, sexuality, religion, etc., etc. So gender is a complex social identity. It's not just women and men. It's also differences among men, among women. It's intersectional in the sense that your race, your age, your class, all of these identities cross and connect. And gender as a concept is highly dynamic. The individual I identify now as Helen Hambly is not the same Helen Hambly of 30 years ago. I am really different. I'm in a different life cycle as a woman. So I'm not the same. So I'm dynamic individually. But then as a social group, my social group of women in southwestern Ontario, Canada, we are also not the same. We are highly diverse and we are highly different because of this intersectionality. Contextually, we're not the same. We vary across geography. So that's why my sister-in-laws in Western Kenya are very different from me and my life here in Canada, but also we vary over time. Women in sub-Saharan Africa today are very different from women in sub-Saharan Africa of 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago. So gender is a complex social relation. So please keep that in mind as I discuss how and why we have this term. Now, I'm lucky with this presentation because just about a week ago, there was another presentation on a very similar topic. And this time, it was the Minister of International Development Assistance, or International Assistance as they call it, for the federal government, Madame Bilbao, and she was presenting on the Weingard visiting lecture tour, and we have this every year at the University of Guelph. And I liked very much the title of the poster, and it was called "The Future is Female." And actually, whoever did this ripped off a demonstration slogan that has been part of the movement of gender for a few years. And "The Future is Female" is actually ripped off of a couple things and put onto this poster. And I thought, oh, I have to find out who in communications did this at University of Guelph, because there's meaning attached to this title. And perhaps it was what we call Global Affairs Canada, formerly CEDA, that did it. So if that's the case, then even better, because there is a connection then with a larger campaign around "The Future is Female." We'll talk a little bit about why it's problematic that they use this terminology of female rather than highlighting gender. But the minister made it very clear that the Canadian government, in working in its international assistance programs from here on in under the Trudeau government, is going to be prioritizing gender transformative approaches. So she announced this, just sort of went off into the air and never really kind of got a clear definition, unfortunately, in my opinion, about what gender transformative approaches were in the Canadian government's mind. But she did make some clear points about why gender. Why is gender still on the agenda for the Canadian government? And she talked about the 750 million people in the world today who are in extreme poverty. So not just low income, but extreme poverty. That we're in an age, as you very well know, where the world has more billionaires than ever before. So we have extreme economic growth in certain industries, and there are some extremely wealthy individuals and corporations, but that there's a growing inequality in the world today. There is a tremendous lack of respect for human rights, even though we have conventions for the elimination of discrimination against women or children's rights conventions that are signed, sealed, delivered by the UN agencies. The actual putting into practice of these conventions is still haphazard at best, even here in Canada. And of course, she said this global isolationism that's pervasive right now is reducing the types of engagement that we saw in international development work in the past. Participatory development, as it's often called, is at an all-time low. There's a tendency to do mega projects in international development, to involve the private sector and embrace the private sector in their aims in development assistance programs, and also just to isolate ourselves from our global responsibility. There's a lot of kickback because of the misuse of development assistance from individual taxpayers who are saying, what has happened to that money? How has that really helped women and children and those who are in extreme poverty? And so she also went on to talk about the fact that we no longer live in an era where we can declare gender neutrality, whether we're scientists, whether we're working in community development, and that at best we might be gender blind, but we are certainly not gender neutral, and that a gender transformative approach should be embraced. And the way the Canadian government is positioning this is actually in very close relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals. And for those of you who are not familiar with these global goals, they apply to all nations of the world, including Canada. And there is a set of goals that we are expected to move towards. And the Canadian government is linking gender in and emphasizing it within those goals. So this was helpful to me for today's presentation. So for those of you who are able to attend, you certainly got a sense of where the federal government is going with this topic. But for those of you who couldn't attend, her presentation, I believe, is on the University of Guelph website soon, if not already. With some data that's coming up from one of the major global NGOs, ActionAid, that works on gender issues. I'm going to focus the topic today a little bit on a case of global agriculture, and I'm going to refer specifically to a part of the world where I've done a lot of work, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And the focus of the presentation and the case is really about what are the institutions who are involved in agriculture, environment, and food security really doing to support overcoming some of these wicked problems that exist today in the world, and especially those who live in extreme poverty. So if you see the ActionAid work here, we're talking about the fact that over 50% of all preventable deaths from pregnancy can be stopped. It's simple. We have the tools, the technology, we have the science. It's just that this is continuing. Malnutrition continues to be a major crisis for women and children, but that this is balanced off with a lack of rights to resources. So less than 20% of the women in sub-Saharan Africa have a name on a title deed, which allows them to use that title deed to go to the bank to get a loan or get capital to invest in an agricultural business, for example. Title deeds are also used, unfortunately, to push women off of land. Either through a breakup of the family or after the death of the husband. So family members can use the male's name on the title deed to basically remove the woman from the land base, and her children in some cases as well. There's more than 100 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or in the world today, that are excluding women from participating in certain types of jobs. So a lot of labor legislation, and ILO's work certainly on gender shows this, are just completely biased against women. And so even being able to achieve particular career aspirations, especially in science and in hard systems industries, is very hard for women. And yet women make up 50% of the agricultural labor and workforce as we know it. So the data is there to support the work. And there are institutions out in the world that have been working on this, as I said, for 30 to 40 years. And I want to focus in on the one that I've worked with most closely. And this is a consultative group on international agricultural research. This is the set of 15 research centers that are known as the Green Revolution Institutes. They do basic research, including advanced genomics and nanotech and a whole range of front-end ag research and environmental research, as well as the applied research side of things through through agricultural innovation and food systems research. There are 15 of the centers. They're all located all over the world. I worked in number 16, which was based in The Hague in the Netherlands for 8 years. It no longer exists, and it was the one center that was doing gender capacity development, extension, and communication. And it was closed down, and that work was folded into the other 15 commodity or natural resource science institutions. And that was cost saving. In the end, that was about cost saving. These centers are very expensive to maintain. But the system itself has been created, and I joined the system in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, but I had worked for IDRC, the Canadian International Development Research Centre, as a program officer. So I was actually a donor to the system. So I've been aware of their work for a very long time. As this timeline shows you, their work actually, after the Green Revolution Institutes were created in the 60s, the work on gender took almost a full decade. In fact, I would argue 2 decades to even get going. So these institutes, which were dedicated to the poor, were completely gender blind for about 2 decades. They were the classic ivory towers that developed research in the name of the poor, but didn't really understand the poor. For many years, there were no social scientists in this system. So it's only fairly recently, about the 1970s, that the first social scientists began to actually be on par or fully employed in the centers. And this is work that in the 1970s was quite groundbreaking. It overlapped with something that was happening around the world, which was called the Women in Development movement. And this is an early policy approach that focused on women only in international development work. In the 1980s, this transitioned out, this focus purely on women, to focus on gender. It was the relationship between women and men that mattered to the 1980s scholars, primarily those scholars who are identified with Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, England. So it's called the Sussex School, Gender and Development, the Sussex School. And in the CG system, the first research programs around gender and women and, say, for example, rice research emerged. These programs started to generate a whole new set of tools that agricultural and environmental researchers could use. And under the gender analysis program headed by Hilary Feldstein, we saw a number of toolkits coming out. These were in fact participatory research tools that took the scientists into what were called participatory trials or participatory action research with farmers before even a breeding program would start or before a soil conservation research project would start. And so in the 1980s, the toolkits emerged from the gender analysis program and started to be scaled up through a number of countries around the world. At the same time, the CG system had a deep look at itself and found that at this point there was less than 2% of all of their scientists were female. And they started asking questions about how does the lack of diversity within our centers reflect in our scientific research work? Is there an issue between the equity between male and female scientists and the kinds of research that are actually coming out the other side? So the gender staffing program started under Deborah Merrill Sands in the 1990s. So I started working with them about 1992, 93, more actively, and this coincided with the 4th conference on women in Beijing, for women and women's rights, and the CG for the first time had, even though it had a fair number of resources, had a representative at this global meeting. So it took until 1995 to actually get the CG to connect their work with what was going on in the rest of the world. Over time, the CG systems work has transformed. They blended the gender analysis with the participatory research work. That program emerged. It was very active in the end of the 20th century into the new millennium. And they also developed an awards program, so literally award, led by one of the top female scientists in sub-Saharan Africa, Dorothy Mukebe, to promote women in science, and especially African women in science. Because not only did they eventually realize that their staff were overwhelmingly male, they also began to realize that the women who were in the system were largely from the United States, Canada, and Europe. And so there was a greater diversification through the beginning part of the millennium. And finally, where are we at now? Well, finally, this global system of 15 centers, including the one research program that I have been the chair of and am now the secretary of, which is $85 million. So it's a huge annual budget. This is annual budgets. This is a lot of money. And it combines the work around roots, tubers, and bananas. And as many of you know, cassava, potato, many of the roots and crops are actual staple crops of the extreme poor. Cassava is known as the food of the poor. And so all of the research done around these crops is contained within this program, and it's a program that links CIAT in Colombia, the Center for International Tropical Agriculture, IITA, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, and CIP, the Center for the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru. These three main centers, along with Biodiversity, based out of Rome. So these centers, the four of the centers, work on this very large RTB program. And recently what we and all the research programs across the CG system have been doing is assessing our gender mainstreaming in research. And the conclusion of the work that started in 2013 is that a lot more has to be done on this front, number one. That although we have developed a lot of agricultural technologies and value chains that have incorporated gender, that we still can do a lot more around mobilizing this agricultural innovation and ensuring that there's benefits to the extreme poor. So the lessons that have been really learned are very interesting to see that there's more discussion among natural scientists and social scientists in the system to talk about how are really extremely poor women and children and men and all social groups accessing these research outputs. So there's a huge pressure on this system, not just to do research, but to translate their research results into development outputs. Secondly is the precautionary principle. And as a School of Environmental Sciences, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the precautionary principle, because you've studied this, I'm sure, and you think about it quite a lot. The no harm policy. For a very long time, the so-called goodwill public research of the CG system was assumed. But now that whole black box of whether or not research outputs have actually harmed women and children, have harmed those in extreme poverty, has been opened up through this very critical approach now taken to gender. And so that's very exciting to see where simple technologies, including agroforestry technologies, are now highly questioned about exactly what did they do to harm, not help, but harm people and distort relations, social relations. So there's a new literature on that, which is also very exciting. And then the third aspect of where the CG is at with gender and transformative approaches is really to talk about increasing in gender equality, to make sure that the research and science we're doing is improving the access to and control over productive assets, the inputs needed for agriculture and environment and food security, and to ensure that the institutions have that at the top of the agenda. So similar to what Global Affairs Canada is saying is that this has to be the entry point into any further and future research they do. So whether or not you're breeding a new potato variety or you're working with some genetic material from indigenous farmers in the Andes, that gender is up front in that discussion at the get-go. So it's not just for the purposes of the body of knowledge of your research field. And that's what's interesting. And that's hard on natural scientists, because natural scientists may never have necessarily had that exposure to putting gender first on the agenda of their research design. So what has to happen in the CG? What's going on now? It's three things. One of them is it's a call to all natural scientists and social scientists to make sure that they're aware of the gender transformative approach. They have to do the analysis, and I'll talk about this in a second, and they have to take action as institutions and as scientists. So awareness plays out in this way. Awareness plays out with having natural scientists re-examine their attitudes and their willingness to reskill themselves. A lot of scientists use the tried and true again and again and again. They're innovative within their own body of research and their own research designs, but they don't necessarily feel very comfortable when they move out of their domain into a domain like gender analysis or gender skills. So that willingness to reskill is really very important. And that, I believe, as a social scientist and as somebody who works in information communication, I truly believe that that's behavioral change. And some people have a greater tolerance to behavioral change than others. And so it's this is probably the toughest area of examining attitudes. The second is organizational culture. What is the institution that natural scientists or interdisciplinary scientists work in terms of giving people credit for taking gender into account? Who's going to recognize that within your publications, for instance, within your promotion and tenure, within your career advancement? How can the organizations and institutions build an organizational culture that respects this type of work and doesn't just farm it out to the so-called gender focal point, which is what's happened in the past? Secondly, developing skills to work with sex disaggregated data. You'll notice here that we talk about sex disaggregated data. Gender is a social relation, so it can't be disaggregated. This intersectionality makes disaggregation impossible. So data is sex disaggregated. What do males do? What do females do? What do females of childbearing age do? What do senior females do? So data is still sex disaggregated. And working with this data as an analyst is tricky. And yet, at the same time, to do gender analysis, we have to focus in on this relational aspect. So how to do analysis calls into questions our methodologies, our theory of change of what we expect to happen based on the research that we're doing. So that's a very active area right now in gender transformative approaches. And then finally, action-oriented research. Action-oriented research to address social exclusion. It's that precautionary principle, that create no harm aspect of action, and transform organizational norms. So what's happening now, as I get close to the end of the presentation, I want to say that we're seeing the gender transformative approach move very quickly around the world into a new era. I'm actually leaving this field now, very actively leaving it, partly because I feel I'm like Sisyphus. I have rolled the boulder up the mountain for over 30 years. And what I really like now about joining the University of Guelph is that I have many students at all different parts of their career who are taking on this agenda for the further research. But I myself am like Sisyphus. I've seen the boulder run over the mountain on the other side now. I've pushed it over the other side, and I'm hoping that that boulder will either do two things. One, be caught by a new era of theorists who want to bring that and break it apart and deconstruct it and reconstruct it with the meaning as new researchers, or the second, break up into pebbles so that gender doesn't become one set of researchers' responsibility, but everyone's responsibility. It's a given for the kind of work we do in the global level. It's no longer treated specially, that there's no longer a gender focal point within institutions. So it's hard perhaps for people who know me to sort of say, how can you give this up? But I feel really free to give it up. And when I came to University of Guelph 14 years ago now, I did start to evolve a new line of research around rural internet here in Ontario with the idea that I gained very much from my global work, which was, how can it be fair that the digital age is available to those who live in a city, but not those who live in the rural areas? How can a country like Canada, who declares communication to be a right, a basic human right, not understand that the broadband and internet is the means of communication? And how can the consolidation of media and communication influence electoral processes in rural areas so that rural areas become part of a new kind of backwater rather than an engine for economic and social development in a country? How do they get excluded? So some of the same social exclusion issues that I worked on globally, I work on now. I just work in the rural areas where I grew up in southwestern Ontario. And while I'm not going to completely abandon the gender side and my advocacy, I'm not going to be doing that work very much. It's going to be done by individuals like yourselves in this room. And I'm going to be there to mentor you. And so are people like Naresh and Peter and many others who have been in this area for some time of blending social and natural science. But what I feel as a feminist researcher, that's the hope that I always had. I always had the hope that feminism would be embraced by everyone and that we would be gender conscious and gender responsive in our research role. So I don't think it's like a negative situation. But boy, I tell you, it is so interesting to see what's coming down the line right now. One is the Gender Summit. So this past year, NSERC, for the first time, got behind the Gender Summit, which is a global movement of natural scientists to speak up and do more, take action on the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially around gender. I was fascinated to see this because the work on gender has always been in SSHRC, always in the social sciences and humanities, never as much as it is right now in NSERC. So it's really sort of an introversion, a changing, a deinstitutionalization in some ways to be able to recreate an institution that's responsive. Another thing that we're seeing is projects like in the CGIAR, the Genovate initiative. And the Genovate initiative is now ensuring that before any breeding of any kind, whether it's genomic and the basic side of breeding, or whether it's trials out in the field, that right from the get-go, gender transformative approaches or gender transformation and this idea of overcoming systemic bias from a gender perspective is integrated into the natural science research design. So Genovate has now been doing training courses, I call them training courses, but capacity building courses with natural scientists all over the world who work in plant breeding to introduce them to the concepts of gender, to look at how gender might play out in a research design at all different aspects, even at the genomic level, which is fascinating. So this is a tremendous opportunity to see where the field is going. So I'm just going to end here. My next slide is actually a non-slide, so I'll come back in a second. It's just some further information, and anybody can also contact me if they'd like some further information. But this is my end of CFIUS story. After rolling the boulder up the hill and having it roll back on me many times over my career, finding new ways to roll the boulder up the hill. Do you remember in the video, CFIUS started moving it up with his back instead of going like this? I've done that too. So I've adapted myself to be able to do the different things. I'm now going to get my seat in the steamroller, and I'm going to work with students who won't be seeing a mountain and a boulder at all in their career. I hope in their life they're not rolling this up the mountain anymore. I hope they're embracing it. I hope they're in the driver's seat to make sure that gender transformation and true integration of these issues actually happen in everyone's work, because frankly, it is all of our job to do that as researchers, as intelligent, educated individuals. So that's my call to action for all of you. We have huge resources here in the University of Guelph to take action. We have people who wave the flag on these issues available to speak to students in particular who are interested in mentoring. And there's amazing things in the wider world that you can connect into. So I just encourage you. I'm sorry that this will be the last time that I'm talking at University of Guelph on this topic, but I don't feel sad about that at all. And we push on, right? So, and it's everyone's job. So all the best. Thank you. So I was asked to speak towards like the 20 to 30 minute mark so that there could be discussion, and a lot of stuff has been happening, of course, in the world of gender these days. And as natural scientists and those interested in agriculture, environment, and food security, I hope I can also facilitate some ideas sharing here. So not so much for me to talk anymore, more for all of you. So anybody want to start with question or observation or challenge? Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, this maybe not a discussion generating question, but you're saying you're letting go of the gender piece, but I guess a lot of your work has taken place in the sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm interested with the whole rural internet thing, because I think there are some really neat things coming out of places like sub-Saharan Africa that have sort of kind of worked around some of the inequality of internet coverage and all
For sure.
that sort of thing to move forward on some economic development and all those types of things.
Yeah, it's so nice. It's so nice because what you're implying is that we actually have the opportunity to learn from the global south, right here in Canada. What was it? The second best place to live in the world after Switzerland. That's the newspaper headline last week. And to be honest with you, when I'm in my telecommunications work and my rural communication work, or across the street at OMAFRA, talking about learning from the global south, people just like right out. They just don't see it. And they say, well, no, we're an industrialized country here. We don't need to learn we don't have anything to learn from there. But it's exactly the opposite. And people who have had that luxury, that tremendous privilege of working in regions like sub-Saharan Africa know exactly what I'm talking about. Because yes, absolutely, social exclusion has been a major issue in connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa, and a huge workarounds. And I've learned a lot from that work and brought it to the work that I do in Ontario. And also to look at exposing the issues, because the digital divide is highly gendered. And here in southwestern Ontario, it's a fascinating experience to see that the major infomediaries at the farm level are women who work off farm, and how women who work off farm bring knowledge assets back into the farm. And how does that fit into how things change, how things innovate on a farm? One of the best things about cheaper technologies, especially these things like mobile technologies, is the opportunities to learn in new ways for rural people, including farmers, but also rural seniors, for example. So looking at social exclusion and poverty around rural internet is definitely what I'm doing now. And I still feel very strongly that this is feminist research. It's just that I don't go to my meetings with, Industry Science and Economic Development Canada, formerly Industry Canada and CRTC, and talk about feminist research right off the bat. I sort of wait and try to work it in. So I'm like Cepheus that way. I'm real cunning, and I know the gods will get me one day, but okay. But right now my boulder is that side. But a huge amount of work still on the gender and agriculture agenda. Yeah.
Are gender transformative approaches applicable to other fields outside of the agricultural field?
Yeah, absolutely. So gender transformative approaches like the general framework, and you notice it's plural approaches, so there's no one size fits all. That's really different from the earlier WID and GAD approaches, which were very much one platform or one policy. And so gender transformative approaches are used in health right now. It's really challenging healthcare and health work to look at gender transformation, this notion of intersectionality and issues around the systemic inequalities within the health system from a gender perspective. So health would be my next one. And it's being played out with gender and engineering, for instance. So engineering is another discipline that's really definitely been exposed to the gender transformative approach. So looking at how does the pipeline of producing engineers or landscape architects for that matter, or any professional designation, how is that gendered right from the early years of that training? So there's some really great work on that front.
Thanks, Helen,
Yeah.
for a good overview of the gender transformative actions that have been taken through CGIAR and other organizations. But we still see, like in some parts of the world, where religious beliefs and cultural aspect related to religious beliefs still acts as a major barrier for gender equality. In India, for example, in some states, gender equality is maintained. In some states, it's sort of a taboo, like even to bring gender. Same in some countries in the Middle East. We have worked in Egypt together. So how can you? I mean, all this awareness, analysis, and actions are still there, but still we are unable to overcome cultural norms associated with religious beliefs. And I mean, can you comment on that?
Yeah. So cultural norms are part of what is called systemic dimensions of gender transformation. So norms, cultural norms, organizational norms, institutional norms, all these kinds of norms, which are routine behaviors, things that are reproduced over a period of time, are part of what we know as gender. I mean, it's implicit in it. What's interesting is that we choose to accept cultural norms and disregard them as individual human beings whenever it suits our purposes, right? So that's the problem, this homogeneous, monolithic type of cultural norm. Women in India don't do this. Canadian men must do this. These types of norming kind of statements have been broken apart many, many times, including by ourselves individually. So my sense is that with cultural norms, what you do is you have to put them up, like a taboo. You put them up and you open them up, and you may tear them down and reconstruct them. And it's best done as a social process. It's best done as a discussion. And that needs to happen within families, within communities, within organizations like universities. We have to do that. And closing down that dialogue and the opening up of cultural norms and repressing that type of free speech is very dangerous, because it's exactly that kind of oppressive behavior that created these systemic inequalities to begin with. Today, something really major happened on a gender front. Anybody know what happened in Canada today?
Yeah, national anthem.
National anthem. Finally, whenever. How did this ever become even an issue? But here's an example. You can't touch the anthem. The anthem's taboo. You can't touch that. You can't change the words of it. It's fascinating to see that, of course you can. What is interesting is you take son's command, just this phrasing, and you ask yourself, well, what's the big deal? Number one, does it really bother me? If it doesn't bother me, then am I willing to give it up? And what does it do to other people? What does it do to other people who are singing that anthem, to repeat it again and again and again? What does that mean to them when they get to that word? Do they feel comfortable with that word? And so finally we've been able to sort of create this sort of decision. And how it got created is another question altogether, because it just came like a bit like out of the blue. Nobody was expecting it today to be announced. But fascinating. And this is how cultural norms change. And it's important in things like anthems and flags and symbology of nations. Because truly to be inclusive as a nation, you want to make sure that those things are accessible and equal, in my opinion anyway. I believe that you don't want to have discriminatory language or images in national symbols like an anthem or a flag. Wars have been fought over those kinds of things too. So cultural norms are always going to be there. But I think most people will accept that cultural norms are interpreted in daily behavior the way people want to, and opening them up as families, societies, communities is always going to be part of the project of social change. It's what's happening now. Even around terminologies like LGBTQ, that has meaning to us, right? In Canada, in other societies around the world, that might have no meaning whatsoever. And so we have to accept that these constructs are created to talk about things like gender, and that they will constantly open up, change, evolve, and be dynamic. The most discriminatory and evident types of language around gender discrimination is stuff like, it's always been this way. This is what's always been done. And I can tell you that rule rarely applies. And then if you say, well, let's talk about the precautionary principle. Let's talk about the harm that so-called always the way it's been done. People then sort of way, oh yeah, there's some really harmful side effects of thinking like this. So I think that precautionary principle now within the gender transformative approach is really crucial. Helps us a lot. Yeah.
I was just wondering about, you said something about sex disaggregated data. I just wondered about how the whole gender fluidity.
Yeah, so this is going to be really interesting, especially NSERC has just announced its GenderNet call for proposals. So if those of you who've been watching the NSERC announcements, there's a number of different areas that they're going to respond to. I think natural scientists have to learn from the past and avoid just simply counting women. We call it the mix and stir approach to gender. That if you just have, say, a trial and you have 50% males, 50% females, you have gender equity or gender equality. You might have parity, but you don't have equality necessarily. So counting women and men, or counting different kinds of women or different kinds of men, that's not the way to go. So we are challenged analytically to move beyond sex disaggregated analysis. We have to do sex disaggregation to a certain extent, but we need to do more gender analysis. We have to really look at the roles and the relations, the access to the resources, the control of the benefits of the scientific or technological work. These are the areas that we have to concentrate more on, not just simply counting men and women and mixing and stirring by putting gender into our research design and saying, okay, we have so many benefits of our science for poor women or women in extreme poverty. That's not gender transformative. And so NSERC is going to be challenged on this. And I think last November when they had the conference, that came up already. It's already being talked about. Engineering saying that just because you have so many female engineers on a project doesn't mean you have a gender transformative approach to engineering. It's not the same. And those of us who are faculty in the university, we know that things like issues like pay equity are a crucial topic for us. But at the same time, very few female faculty will say just adding more female faculty to the University of Guelph isn't going to solve the gender discrimination that occurs in the University of Guelph. Most of us get that. So it's not just mixing and stirring, putting women into the pot or putting men who identify as gay into the pot and mixing them into a topic in your research design. No, that's like the worst way to go about science. So,
yeah, just kind of thinking that it sort of adds a whole other dimension to, you said gender is a complex, socially constructed thing.
Yeah.
And so now I think that holds it up even more, like it just adds to that.
Yeah. So more emphasis on methodology, the logic of the way that we're using our research methods, and the theory of change. So that literature is called theory of change, and it's really important. What are the assumptions that we're going into our study with? How are we going to open up and expose these from a gender transformative perspective? What is the expectation of the benefit of our science and technology for those who are currently perhaps even harmed by current science and technology, or just not left better off? The status quo. So these are the kinds of questions that are more critical. Yeah. Yeah, Ola?
Thank you. Now that you said you put the rock down, one way to want to know what were your strengths for us to be able to break the smaller boulder that is the other side now.
Yeah.
One wants to ask, what were your strengths in pushing the bigger rock?
Oh, that is such a nice aspect of this story. Is maybe I got some muscle power over the years. You're sort of suggesting, yeah, and I think that's what's great about what I'm doing now with my life, being here at the University of Guelph, which is individuals like you and others who see this as part of their work. Or joining international projects, the ones Peter and Naresh and I have collaborated on. Yeah, I mean, I think that I did build up strength, and that strength helps me to go on and do other things. So it's not gone. It's just that I feel that we have really reached a point where the gender boulder has gone over the mountain. And the question is, I think it's rolling down right now. The question is, what's going to happen to it? Is it going to break up and become all of our responsibilities? Because I can see it being mainstreamed into something like NSERC, which blows me away. I can see the CG system now no longer being able to launch a new research project without a gender analysis up front, not down the road, but up front. And then the Minister for Development Assistance saying that we have a new feminist or a feminist a policy for international assistance. That kind of blew me away. But at the same time, don't take things at surface level. Continue the critical thinking, because my big thing, and I mean maybe now I'm going to be in trouble because I'm saying this on recording, is as Canadians we need to say, okay, if 15% of the funding is going to go to gender transformative international assistance, it's 15% of what? Of what? Because development assistance has been plummeting in Canada. It was supposed to be 0.6% of our GDP. It hasn't been at that level since the 1960s, Trudeau, like his father's era. So it's 15% of what? And why 15? Why not 50? Why not 75? So I see some other people who are saying, we kind of saw through the smoke and mirrors to a certain extent when the minister was here. But we as Canadians have to be honest with ourselves and not fool ourselves to think that the government is doing the absolute best it can. It can still do better. It needs to be everyone's responsibility in Global Affairs Canada, as well as every taxpayer needs to understand that 15% is still not good enough, frankly, and especially if the budget's declining. So I may have a bit of an issue after this once it goes on the web. Yeah.
Can you think of any reason resources that might be beneficial for the uninitiated. I'm not super familiar with gender transformative processes.
Yep.
For things like, with agroforestry, we know there are certain practices that are, beneficial sort of universally.
Yeah, it's really quite that's a great question. And what's super is that if those of you who are wondering about this are in your academic career, attending something like this is great. Go out and try to attend every lecture, every special topic. Talk to people who are doing the mixed methods kind of research, like students in CEDRED in my school. Many of them are incorporating gender into their major research papers or their thesis. Talk to faculty, those of us who've been working in the field. Link up with NGOs who are really expert in this area. Even if you're in a very obscure part of natural science, I can tell you there's probably somebody who's interested in that area converged with gender. It is part of the frontier of many natural sciences to combine these different types of analytical tools and methods. There's a huge number of toolkits and approaches out there in the world. So FAO still produces some of the best for agriculture, in my opinion, and the World Bank and others have got huge resources. If you're just surfing the net, you just see a massive amount. Now the big question is will those tools and processes and the way that they're applied to your work, they mix with this gender transformative approach? And that's where groups like Genovate and the CG could be really useful. And the program coordinator out of the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam has ensured that all of the gender work now is online. So it's also about creating open access to resources, because unfortunately a lot of agriculture, gender and environment work over the last 30, 40 years hasn't been really accessible to other researchers. The journals are almost non-existent, so you're either publishing in social science journals, and there's a few special articles in the natural sciences, but it hasn't been really accessible.
Okay.
But there's a huge amount of work that you can tap into.
Thank you.
Yeah, take a women's studies course, take a gender studies course. Yeah, all of these could be good opportunities for you while you're a student. Yeah, great, thanks.
I think Paul has left Helen, and we have to leave the room 5 minutes before
Yes.
because there's another
There's a class.
And on behalf of the SES Communication Committee, I would like to thank you, Helen, for
Yeah.
coming and making this presentation. I have learned a lot. We have worked together for more than 14 years now, mostly in Ghana. And she has taught me men's crop and women's crop and how to analyze. So thank you so much for that education. So on behalf of SES,
Thanks, Naresh. Thanks, guys.